Hi, today I'm going to talk a little bit about ideas of democracy. Now, I live in the United States and we talk a lot about democracy, the importance of democracy, but of course, it's kind of one of those ambiguous terms of what does that really mean? What's really valuable about it? Let's take a big step back and look at world history and think about where democracy fits in. So I'm going to talk about a couple different books. This book I read last year, The Decline and Rise of Democracy by David Sestabovich. Uh, Good book, lots of interesting thoughts, and I'm going to rely heavily on this for what I'm talking about. I'll also throw in a little bit about this book, Dynasties, A Global History of Power, by Jerion Duyndam. Sorry, I don't speak Dutch. I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name. So let's begin. Where does democracy come from? Now, you might have heard that England is the mother of all parliaments. No, sorry, England. Wasn't you guys. England did play an important role in spreading the modern sense of democracy today, but if you want to talk about the idea of democracy, it really kind of goes back to tribal societies where you would have a council of people get together, and that can be found all around the world. So let's compare that with, of course, autocracy. That's where you have one central person and they're in charge and they say what goes. A dictatorship, a absolute monarch. So maybe for a second, let's ask why throughout history was autocracy so prevalent? What is the advantage of that? Well, Herodotus has an old story, and it's more of a Greek myth than history, or think of it as sort of a Greek drama. So Darius, who is going to become, the king of the Persians, is staging a coup with his friends. And before the coup, they say, "What kind of government are we going to set up?" So one of them says, "Let's set up a democracy," which just at that time kind of meant mob rule, and everyone's like, "No, that's the stupidest form of government. It's just a mess. Nothing gets done. It's just there's no clear decision." And someone says, "Okay, well, let's set up an oligarchy where we just have a council of people, and they'll make agreements, And someone says, "Well, it's eventually they'll all fight, so and one will come out on top. So let's just cut to the chase. Let's just have an absolute monarch." And the idea is you have one person in charge. They set the rules. They're in charge, let's say for 30 years, and everything goes as planned. You don't have these elections where it goes one way and then they change the policy and it goes another way. It's all just one thing. And if it's a good dictator, it's really good. If it's a bad dictator, it's really bad. So that's kind of why throughout history there has been so many dictatorships and why they kind of last, because it's a long-term point of stability. It's a clear trajectory over a long period of time of things being the same. And at least what Sestabich sort of argues in his book about what are the conditions that create a democracy versus a autocracy has to do a lot with environmental reasons. So if you live in a terrain that's large, flat, can grow a lot of food, people are kind of concentrated close together, say a river valley like Mesopotamia or the Nile, the Indus Valley, the Yangtze or Yellow River, the early places of civilization. People are close together, so you can have an army sort of go control them and set up a autocracy. It's easy for stationary bandit to control that area, tax people, control the area, and set up an autocracy. And so it just kind of naturally folds into that system. Now, other places where people live in more remote, spread out places, you have more of an incentive to have a council system because these places are so rugged, and it's not easy for one army to sort of control the area. People combine or unite through agreement, and he goes through some different cultures throughout history that have these sort of council systems. So you have the Mari people, and that was sort of a mountainous region in Mesopotamia that had a council system. Of course, the ancient Greeks, but the ancient Greeks were not particularly unique. There were other places. Ancient Greece it's a pretty mountainous area. Greece is a mountainous area. The Tlaxcala people in Mexico, the Luba people. Now, the Savage doesn't describe them, but Robert Radaray from that's talked about in the Dynasties. He's that is the Asante people in Africa are described as a form of government similar to the ancient Greeks, where they have a council system. Now, one thing that I should note is that this form of democracy, some of these could be called oligarchies, because it's not like you have the common citizen voting. You have your council of the super powerful, patriarchs of the system running the system. So I'm not here to say that these, it was always great or perfect, how we would put it in, the 21st century, and the idea of democracy. Some other democracies, can't remember the name, Buddha's hometown. He was from a democratic area, in, I guess, northern India or near Nepal. It was a mountainous area. And one interesting thing I talked about in a different video, the idea of meritocracy. So when you have an autocracy, you have a system, a chain of command, and that can have meritocracy. It can possibly, you can put your chain of command, you can put the most talented people or the most meritorious people, they go up the ranks. Whereas a democracy is not, it's not necessarily that thing. You could have a meritocratic democracy, but you could also have a meritocratic autocracy. They're kind of separate things, and meritocracy and democracy, I think they're both good things on paper, but of course they're frustrating. They don't always, work out as smoothly as we would like them to be. And of course, there's the famous Winston Churchill saying about democracy is the worst form of government except all the rest. And you could say the same thing about meritocracy. What they do, and part of these challenges is they have to do with large groups of people. So if you're in a small group of people, say a hunter-gatherer group, where you only have about 30 people, anthropologists have found it's pretty easy to find consensus. But, once you get to bigger and bigger groups, it's harder to make agreements and work things out that are going to be fair for larger groups of people. And you might have small classes of people that end up taking control of everything. So it is a long struggle. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about this book, Dynasties. Now, this book really focuses on 1300 to 1800, and it's more about autocratic systems or monarchies. At the end of the book, they sort of compare what would be modern examples, and you could think of, say, like a corporation run by a family. Think of like the Trump family or something. It's like, Donald Trump would love the Trump family to be sort of a dynasty where he passes on to Donald Trump Jr., blah, blah, blah. Jared Kushner and his daughter, they're all in this little corporate entity that sort of acts in a similar fashion. And, this book looks at dynastic institutions, which are different than a council of people, and how they operate. So now I wanted to, it looks, it's kind of a concentric circles. So it starts with, it starts with the person, and then it goes over to the, succession issues, and then out to the group, and then the realm. So there's sort of a court. And so there's this, circles of power. And there are some interesting things that I thought about with these two books. And one has a lot to do with, producing, going on to the next dynasty. So one of the things this book talks about, and I want to be clear, this book is not sort of a Eurocentric book, but it does say that it does talk a little bit about how these council systems did start in, they really were more prevalent in Europe. And that was partially because for a long time Europe was a backwards place in the medieval period. You had councils, and it was actually promoted by the Catholic Church that was trying to create, a larger network of power. They needed some incentives. They would create these councils to, form agreements. Whereas you would have in the, in the other parts of Eurasia, you would have that what we call, it's a racist term, you could say, is Oriental despotism. So that's the system. You have this one centralized autocrat, and say the Mughal or the Ottoman Empire or the Chinese dynasties, and the Safavid, whatever. Now life is more complex than that. There's more to it, but there are some interesting things going on. So in the early European medieval period, you would have the commune system. Now that's not the modern term of commune, what we think of today, but that is a city with a council, and you would have a little city state, that would run a council. You would also have, of course, different dynasties, and of course you have Europe, and it's famous for having all these marriages between the different dynasties to form power alliances, have these arranged marriages, and whereas in the further east you would have harems, and that does reflect a lot about gender equality, but there is a component of power. And so this book, talks about, how Europe did have that. It's not to say that's an exclusive thing. That's just, what we know through history. And so, autocracy, harems, I'm sort of wondering what is the relationship, whereas the other side is these sort of marriage alliances through the European dynasties. Now, one question is, because a lot of times these European monarchs, they'd run out of people to marry to consolidate power. So they'd end up, marrying a close relative. So do you want a leader that's going to, marry their cousin or have a harem? Obviously you want a democratic leader. That's the correct choice. That it's irrelevant who they marry, and how you run these things. And there's other questions within the Dynasties book. That one thing I thought was particularly interesting was there's sort of this ritual period, a seasonal thing where you might have a central capital where people sort of congregate and come together, like all the king's lords sort of come together, and they do a sort of ritual. An example would be, say, in Tudor England, where starting around the time of Henry VIII, all the lords from around the countryside would come to London, and they would, enjoy a Shakespeare play and hang out on the West End of London. And that was a way of, these lords would keep one foot in their sort of, uh, particular region, so out somewhere else, like, East Anglia or somewhere in the Midlands in England versus, and then also sort of coming to a centralized point. So there is sort of this element of centralization. What does this all have to do with democracy? Well, it does have to do with, how you, the sinews of power, of how things get consolidated. Because there is this question of, more centralization means more power, which is more effective, which means you can have more control, but then, is that fair for other people? So how do you have an effective democracy? Now, one of the important things that they do say was a big contribution to England's contribution to democracy was the idea of no mandates. So back in the European time, they would have mandates. So your representative would be sent to the capital to go vote on particular issues, and you would have mandates, right? No new taxes. All right, and there's a famous event where the a representative in Spain went to the Cortes. That was their parliament. They said the mandate was no new taxes. He voted for taxes. They came. When he got back, they killed him. They burnt down his house. The public was really angry. So there's this difference between, in England they got rid of mandates in the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, I think around the 1300s. They're like, whoever is representative, they have to come in and they have to be able to, not be locked into a position where they have to follow these particular rules, but they have to vote based on this. And of course, that's the dynamic of, all politicians are liars. They promise the moon to the public to get elected, and then once they go into Congress or Parliament, they just do whatever, ignore all their promises. But then on the other side, if you have mandates, not a lot gets done. Probably in the 1990s, the Republicans had this famous mandate, that was the age of Newt Gingrich, and not a lot got done, and we are still, perhaps not officially, but we have some very rigid kind of mandate things going on, and a lot of complaining about anything getting done in Washington today. Things do actually some things get done, but a lot of the big issues are, in deadlock and partisan divide, at least in the United States. It's really difficult to find sets of agreements. So, anyway, it's like meritocracy, democracy's a big headache, trying to work things out with a lot of people. I'm probably not giving this book quite its justice. It's worth reading. I'm not saying you might not like everything you hear. It's of course showing that democracy is a real struggle. It's not going to be perfect. There's some interesting stuff about what the U.S. sort of contributed, and at least back when the late 18th century, when the U.S. Constitution was started, it had a big influence. It was ahead of its time, and nowadays, maybe not so much. There's a lot of things that probably we would think of that are. I know this is just turned into a commercial for this book, but whatever. Some interesting questions that the book could probably explore more. Another book could explore the differences between sort of rural versus urban culture. How that affects people's mentalities and values. That seems to be reflective in our own political parties in the U.S. today. And understanding how the the rights of women, the women being able to vote. So in a lot of these early democracies that I was talking about, going back to ancient times, like the Tlaxcalans or the Luba people or Asante or whatever, they would. It was only men, and you had to serve and fight in the military. Oh, also the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois, is another example that they spent a lot of time in. Don't want to leave them out. Um, so the role of women in having a political voice and that emerging in the around the very late 19th century. I think New Zealand was the first country to allow women to vote, unless you want to count the widow vote in New Jersey or something. In for a few years in early U.S. There's a lot. There's a lot to unpack. I'm certainly not saying anything definitive. These are just a couple things that I think are worth knowing about, and to understand the history of democracy is a very long question, and of course, I'm also talking about the harems and the women having the right to vote. Women's agency, their ability to influence, and how society can be equitable and fair, and do a better job of doing all those things. So I don't know. This is a book getting to yes. I boost this book all the time. I think it's fundamental to talking about how to make agreements. Now, of course, democracy is all about making agreements. It's not just about voting. I think actually, if you limit having the right to vote is important, but in my opinion, democracy is not just about voting. It's really about being able to speak your mind and discuss issues. But how do you do that constructively? So, focus on your interests, don't take positions, understand the other party's interests, invent options of mutual gain, use objective criteria. These are different aspects of how you make agreements and make things work. And I think it's not a particularly partisan thing to be able to effectively make a good agreement, which is critical to democracy. So anyway, those are just a couple ideas. Thought I'd share them, put them on the internet. Have a good day.